To flag that. Thank you, India. So also just for some context on today's format, I'll do a very brief introduction of our speakers who will then present for roughly 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll have 30 minutes roughly for Q&A. You're welcome to kind of drop questions in the chat as we go along for our speakers, and I can pull them out when we do the Q&A, or folks are welcome to kind of raise their hand, but I'll go through them again when we get to the Q&A. So now for our speakers. So we're joined by Joe O'Connor, who is the CEO and co-founder of Work Time Reduction, a global consulting and research organization which specializes in shorter work week models and reduced hour outcomes focused working. Sounds great. And we're also joined by Kønsov Hansen, who is the CEO at the newly established Institute for the 4-Day Workweek in Denmark, a research and consulting company dedicated to creating sustainable work lives for more people. And previously, Bo was the CEO or the co-CEO of the tech company Abshin, which was one of the first Danish companies to switch to a 4-day week nearly 5 years ago. We'd love to see it. So great. And also glad to see we've had a few more folks able to join on the link. It's fabulous. So I'll hand it over to Joe to get us started. And yeah, I think that's it.
All right. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here very quickly. Maybe if somebody could let me know if you can see this, that would be great.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, fantastic. So I know there's a lot of people from the trade union, European policy world on this call. I'm originally from Ireland. I first got interested in this topic when working as a trade union official with Forsa, Ireland's largest public service labour union. And when we did some research in the public service and found that we had a lot of working parents, mostly women, who had already reduced their work time to better accommodate their caring and domestic responsibilities. But often we found that their job expectations and responsibilities hadn't changed, and the productivity that they were achieving in the reduced week was often the same as it was when they were working full time. So that really got me fascinated in this topic. I've spent, the last number of years working with companies to help them to make this transition, and delighted to be working with the team at Autonomy again, who I worked closely with on the UK pilot a couple of years ago, which feels like a million years ago, but was quite recent. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about why companies are doing this and how they're doing it. Maybe just to start with a quote from an American politician, backbreaking toil and mind-wearying tension will soon be left to machines and electronic devices. And you might suspect that that was from Bernie Sanders, who recently brought a bill to Congress on this issue, but it was actually from the Republican president, Richard Nixon, all the way back in 1956. And I think that demonstrates that a shorter work week was not a radical idea then, and it's not a radical idea today. And in fact, work time reduction has historically always been the way that we've shared productivity and gains and technological advancements with the workforce. But for whatever reason, this has stalled and flatlined in the last number of decades. On average, in most Western democracies, we're working roughly the same as we were in the 1980s. And we still have the same standard work week structure as we did in the 1920s, when women made up 20% of the workforce. So I would argue that actually arguing for things to stay the same in a world where AI is at our door is probably a more radical position than making the case for change. So just to capture with a few statistics, really where we've come to with this issue, because when I first started talking about this about 6 years ago, most people in Ireland thought that this was a pretty crazy idea. But COVID really changed the landscape. It led to employees, I think, really seeing more flexibility and more time as a very big priority and as a important demand. And it also led to employers being much more open-minded to new ways of working. So if you take, for example, that top statistic, 69% of senior managers here in Canada said that they expected to see their business make the switch to some form of 4-day work week, compressed or reduced, in the next 5 years. And I think you'll all agree there was probably no way you would get that kind of result or that kind of finding if you did the same survey 4 to 5 years ago. We're also seeing Canadians at the bottom listing this as one of their top 3 most attractive employment benefits, even ahead of remote work flexibility. So I think for organizations who maybe can't pay top dollar in terms of salaries, or can't offer the same level of work from home flexibility due to their industry and the type of work, this can be a very compelling, creative, alternative way to remain relevant and competitive when it comes to attracting and retaining talent. So the three big reasons that we're observing as to why leaders and organizations are reaching out to people like us interested in trying out reduced hour work time models can really be categorized under three main headings. They're either looking at this as a lever to boost employee engagement and innovation, and in turn to boost productivity. They're looking at this as a tool to address issues with employee well-being and burnout within the workforce, or they're looking at this as an opportunity to differentiate themselves in an increasingly competitive labor market when it comes to attracting and retaining talent. And sometimes it's some combination of those different factors. And I think a lot of this is about really thinking differently about productivity and well-being and seeing them not as competing forces, but as complementary forces that are intrinsically linked. And the evidence and the organizational science is really clear on this. Happier, healthier employees lead to more productive, flourishing organizations. So we've seen often during the financial crisis, during COVID, recently with the return to the office remote debate, this idea that, workplace benefits and flexibility is like a push and pull. It's a series of trade-offs depending on how the market is performing. And I think that that completely misses the point. We need to see these as complementary forces. And we saw this in a recent research paper that we collaborated with the think tank in Australia on the state of workplace burnout. It was the fourth year. It's the world's biggest longitudinal study on burnout. And for the first time, they compared burnout impacts in organizations with reduced hour work models to those with standard work weeks. And they found that a third of the workforce are less likely to be burnt out in organizations who work reduced hours. And again, I would argue that this is not just an individual wellness issue. This is a major corporate challenge where if actually you're able to unlock those people from experiencing fatigue, from experiencing diminished performance, from experiencing all of the symptoms of burnout that we're familiar with, that's probably the single biggest thing as a leader you could do to make your organization more productive. So what do we mean when we talk about work time reduction? Our definition is that we're not talking about compressed hours. We're talking about the same pay, reduced hours, but a commitment to achieving the same or better outcomes. But this doesn't mean doing the same work in the same way in less time. Successfully adopting reduced work time models is as much about changing the way that people work as it is about changing the hours that they work. Really challenging the inputs and figuring out how can we do better work more efficiently, not the same work quicker. And so some of the key principles that we really believe are critical to achieving this is, first of all, that this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It needs to be designed to accommodate the needs of the business and the preferences of employees. It's fundamentally a work redesign initiative. And it's, in our opinion, it's not just a perk. It actually needs to act as an incentive and as a forcing function to streamline operations, to improve processes, and to change work practices. Maybe we will arrive, hopefully with all of our collective work, in a world in 5 or 10 years where the 4-day work week is the norm and where being a 4-day week company isn't very hard. But the reality today is to be a 4-day work week company in a 5-day week world where most of your clients, your competitors, your stakeholders are working 5 days, it requires a real commitment from everyone in the organization in order to be able to make it work. And it doesn't necessarily always look like a 4-day work week. We've seen lots of organizations adopting shorter work days, things like 9-day fortnight or half-day Friday, either as a step on the road to a 4-day work week or as something that might be more achievable for them based on their unique business context. And it's linked to this idea of Parkinson's law, which brings me back to those working parents in Ireland who are managing to achieve the same level of work in less time. Parkinson's law is about this concept that a task expands to fill the time available for its completion. A shorter work week is basically like Parkinson's law in reverse. It's creating an intentional constraint around time in order to drive better ways to achieve the same goals. Another important concept in this work is this idea of the Pareto principle. This idea that not every hour in the work week or in the work day is created equal, and that often in many modern organizations, 20% of the effort will lead to 80% of the results. We recently saw some research from Slack, who surveyed thousands of desk workers all over the world, and they found that desk workers on average reported that about 41% of their work week was being spent on low or no value adding activities, repetitive tasks, or tasks that were not meaningful or relevant to their direct job function. And this is really the kinds of busy work that you need to attack if you're going to be successful in adopting a shorter work week. So often what we find is that the shorter work week for many organizations is actually already here. It's just buried under the rubble of things like poorly run, overlong and unnecessary meetings, distractions and interruptions in the workday, poor use of technology, and outdated, inefficient processes. And once you put in place a framework and an incentive structure to address these kinds of issues in your organization, you find that offering a reduced work week is well within your reach. And I think it's also important to link this to the other major development that we're all experiencing in terms of the world of work, which is artificial intelligence, which in the last 12 months has really, I think, became a much bigger part of our lives and is probably going to continue to become an even bigger part of our lives in the years to come. I think there's a reality here that we've seen for many of those organizations who've successfully adopted reduced hours up to now. They have used technology to automate certain tasks and to streamline administrative processes. Obviously, the scope and the potential for that is now much, much greater today than it even was 2 to 3 years ago. So AI can really be an enabler to unlock the capacity within organizations to accommodate work time reduction. But we also believe work time reduction can be a really powerful incentive to drive AI adoption on the other side. We've seen a recent survey of executives saying that they're experiencing 55% of executives are experiencing resistance within their organizations to adopting AI. And is that surprising when you think about the amount of fear, the amount of uncertainty, the sense that actually this is going to be used to lead to layoffs or to job displacement? I think there's an opportunity to really frame this in a much more positive way, in a win-win, where the benefits of this are shared equally between the organization and the workforce in the form of work time reduction. Some of the common challenges that we see organizations have with doing this, the first is the light switch. The CEO who wakes up one morning with a really bright idea and says, Friday, we're moving straight to a 4-day work week without any proper planning, structure, or intentionality. This is something which we've seen it work eventually. We've seen some organizations who have done it in this way, build the aircraft while it's in flight and eventually land the plane. But it tends to be a much more chaotic, bumpy ride rather than the kind of smooth, seamless transition that you really should be aiming for. We've seen organizations really just think it's up to the executive or it's up to the C-suite to come up with all the answers, when in reality, this works at its best when it's a bottom-up process where you empower employees to come up with the ideas, the solutions. The reality is the most detail-oriented CEO in the world doesn't know the day-to-day intricacies of each one of their employees' jobs well enough to tell them this is how you need to redesign it. The panacea pitfall is this idea that the shorter work week will solve all of our problems. And probably the hard truth is, in the early stages, it actually surfaces a lot of problems. It brings a lot of system and process challenges, a lot of niggling frustrations that were maybe bubbling under the surface. It brings those to the fore so that you can address them. So it takes courage to be willing to really engage with that process. And it also, a shorter work week complements strong, positive cultures. It doesn't fix bad cultures. So if you're an organization that has a lack of trust, a lack of autonomy, no flexibility, lack of accountability, the shorter work week isn't just going to make all of those things better. This is something that actually requires the organization to have some of those traits or to actively develop them and address them as part of their transition to a shorter work week. So I'm just going to talk very quickly now about I'm looking at the clock, about 2 or 3 minutes left. So a few quick fire tips around how you can make this work in an organization. The first is that you need to be much more structured and intentional about how you plan your workday and how you design your work week. Thinking about doing the most challenging work at the times when you are most productive, which for most people follows the circadian rhythm, but for others, it might look a little bit different. Really scheduling heads down time to do focused work and for breaks in the same way as you would schedule meetings, and really thinking about what does my workday look like today and what does it need to look like for my type of job if I'm going to be successful in a shorter work week. You need to avoid this idea of the switch cost effect. A whole lot of us think that we're great at multitasking. The science is pretty clear. The vast majority of people are terrible at multitasking, and it's the enemy of productivity. So addressing task switching and interruptions to the best that you can avoids this switch cost effect, where it takes a long period of time for you to get back to that same level of focus and that same level of flow on a task when you've been disrupted and switched off it. The obvious one, more effective meetings. Really like this framework from Adam Grant, which is there are 4 reasons to meet. It needs to either be to make a decision, it needs to be to learn something, to bond as a team, or to do something, to actively problem solve together. If it doesn't serve one of those purposes, you should probably cancel it. And I would also say, if it's trying to serve a number of those purposes all at once, it's probably not going to be a very effective meeting. Recognizing that breaks are often just as important to someone's productivity and well-being as time off outside of work and downtime. So building in things like meeting times becoming 25 minutes or 45 minutes instead of 30 minutes or an hour, so people can have those micro breaks to refresh and recharge within the workday, also really important. And so there's a reality that the way that we talk about, the way that we think about, and the way that we measure productivity is still very similar to the way that we did back in the world 100 years ago, when it was a mostly manufacturing and industrial economy. So for most people in most jobs today, being productive isn't about doing more stuff in less time and showing up for longer. So it's not about, chewing the same task like a cow, and the longer that you do it, the more productive you're going to be. That's not the reality for today's jobs, and it's almost certainly not going to be the reality for tomorrow's jobs with the direction of travel that we're seeing with AI and automation. So it needs to be much more about working like lions, where you have highly focused performance episodes punctuated with breaks, rest, downtime, and ideally a shorter work week. So I think the vision that many organizations are trying to achieve when they're looking at something like work time reduction is recognizing that the market leaders of 10 years from now are probably not going to be the organizations that are all about hustling harder and working longer. They're going to use technology to drive efficiencies. They're going to share the benefits of those efficiencies with their employees so that they're more productive and that they have better well-being. They're going to use this to offer a value proposition that gives people a greater quality of life, which I think is the thing that people most want in today's world. That's going to help them attract and retain top talent and their best people. And it's probably going to mean that they're going to be at the cutting edge of both talent and technology. So I think that's the opportunity that many organizations see, and hopefully with your help, many more organizations will see. So thanks, and looking forward to the conversation.
Joe, thank you so much. That was really insightful. We appreciate it. And we're looking forward to kind of diving into that a bit more in the Q&A. Bo, when you're ready, we can hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you. You see my slides now? Yep. So thank you very much for the introduction. As Grace said, I'm Kønsov Hansen. I am currently the CEO of Institute for 4-Day Workweek in Denmark. I am still a co-owner, and I'm a former CEO of Aption, an IT company that is one of the first companies in Denmark switched to a 4-day workweek. A lot of my presentation today draws from my experiences with Aption. So I'm kind of like wearing 2 hats. But I am happy afterwards, if you have questions to the movement in Denmark in general, to answer your questions as good as I can. First, a little bit of context on Aption from where my experience derives. It's a digital agency. It was founded in 2018. 45 employees spread across two offices. A consultancy company where we bill by the hour important information for you to remember when I talk a little bit about our story with reducing our work time. So we are back in 2019, where we decided to go from this normal in Denmark, the 37-hour work week to a reduced work week, working only Monday through until Thursday, 30 hours a week, and closing the office for the whole company on Fridays. And why did we choose to do that? There is a lot of reasons, but the primary motivation came from us having expanded a lot. We had doubled in size within a year. We had gotten bigger clients with bigger demands. We were growing as a company in all sorts of ways. But we also sometimes, and it has been our dream, even ever since we started, to come to this point. But we also found ourselves in a very hectic everyday, where stuff wasn't really working for us, especially the collaboration between us was lacking. And it was because in our efforts to create a great company with the best possible conditions and terms to be productive, we had by accident also grown a culture of individual heroes. We had flexible working hours, we had a remote-friendly policy, and we were working very, very asynchronous across the company. Stuff that had been fruitful when we were a smaller company, and where we, in very small teams, often only consisting of one person, could handle our clients in smaller groups. But when we got the bigger clients with the bigger demands, we needed to scale our collaboration, working in teams of 10 or 12 people at a time. And at that point, it was an issue that we were working somewhat similar to this. Here you will see a representation of a very realistic work schedule back in the days. It's a team of 4 people. Each of these purple beams represent a person. Team of 4 people trying to work together. The yellow beam in the middle of it represents that was the natural overlapping time we had, meaning that we would schedule a lot of meetings to get face-to-face time, also meaning that we would do a lot of writing instead of talking. Another issue with this very flexible work schedule was that we were cheated by our own overconfidence. As some of you might know, we have a lot of cognitive biases. It's building into our brains. One of them is called overconfidence bias, and it's our tendency to always overestimate our own abilities looking into the future. And that can be a little bit harmful sometimes if you do not have like a fixed frame around your work time, because when you don't really have a dedicated work time, you would have a tendency to like push work into the evening or make it take up more time. As you just saw Joe going through Parkinson's law, that's Parkinson's law in play right here. That when I don't have a work like a work day, I would use my whole day with work. I mentioned that we were going from a 37-hour work week, and it's actually not true because of the flexibility paradox that we have totally flexible working hours. We were actually working a lot more. On average, 5 hours more per week per person, meaning that we work 32 hours a week. That was an issue, especially because those extra hours wasn't doing any good in terms of more billable hours. Actually, it was preventing us from having the billable amount of billable hours that we needed. Our utilization wasn't as high as it was supposed to be, and it wasn't as high as it could be. Less than 50% of our hours were ending up on bills due to lack of quality. We couldn't simply justify putting those hours spent in the evening, often on bills for clients. It wasn't worth it. So in order for us, that was one of the reasons why we chose to go into the 4-day work week. And one of the first things we did, and it came button up, was that the biggest challenge for us, or the biggest barrier for us to collaborate, is that we do not work on the same time. We do not work synchronous. And it's also an issue that we actually do not know what the expectations are towards each other. Am I expected to work 42 hours a week, or am I expected to actually keep my work hours? So we sat down and decided on a schedule that would fit every one of us, or at least as far as possible. And we decided that we would have that we could come in as early as 7:30 in the morning, no later than 9. But the most important part, that we wouldn't split up our working hours in separate time slots during the day. That we should take the work day in one take, and work no more than 7.5 hours a day, no more, no less. The next step we did was to separate the make time from meeting time, so we could avoid task switching, context switching, and the ability to come into a deeper state of focus, and also to actually suppress the amount of meetings we had, because we had a lot of meetings, way too many meetings, preventing us from actually making stuff, so talking about it instead of making it. So by suppressing the meetings to the afternoon and limit the time available for them, we reduced the amount of meetings with about 50%. And those 50% were moved directly to make time, and also to billable time, and to work satisfaction, because suddenly we started feeling more productive, and this feeling of productive made us more engaged in our work, because now we could really track progress in the everyday, instead of coming home from work with the feeling of, today I didn't manage to do any fruitful work either again. Yeah. We did also other stuff, but that's for another time. This is our timeline of implementing the 4-day work week. It was quite fast. Now, as an advisor today of companies doing this transition, I advise them to take a little bit longer time, especially if they are bigger, because these changes take time. We did it quite fast, and it went okay. We started in implementing from September. We started with one Friday off. Then October we took 2 Fridays off. Then we actually jumped ahead to take all the 4 Fridays off in November. The reason why we did that was because we have the plan of the changes we had to do was maybe a little bit optimistic. So in order for us to actually squeeze it in, we had to have the extra free time to move all our personal errands and all the stuff that we currently, or at that time, used our flexibility for. We needed that Friday as the outlet for these kind of things. So we and at the same time, we saw that the productivity was coming along, so we dared to speed it up a little. In March, year after, we ended the trial and decided to continue. 13 days after, we were hit by the lockdown, and that's also a story for another time. But very quickly, I can say that the 4-day work week really helped us during lockdown. October, we set in October of the first time we had 2 Fridays off. We did an all-time revenue record. We broke that record again in November, and we were quite surprised about this outcome, because, as I mentioned in the beginning, We are consultants. We bill our work by the hour, so it's a little bit of a paradox that we can actually charge more hours when we work less hours. But we could, because the quality of our work started to rise tremendously, and so did our client satisfaction, meaning that we could simply bill more hours than we could when working longer. Fun thing is that when we compared a quarter before 4-day work week with the first quarter after work week, we had reduced our work time with 29%, and we had increased our revenue with 29%. One of the other things that we were very interested in, of course, is how would our employees handle this transition. We were a little bit worried that it would put an extra pressure on them and cause extra stress. I think that was a very important part of the move, that we were cautious about it. And as you can see here, it paid off. Our employees really loved it. And I think that the increased feeling of productivity turning into increased engagement is what you see here. For those who don't know what an employee net promoter score is, it is a KPI telling how basically how engaged your employees is. We had a net promoter score on 88. It's very stable in that area, and to know to just have some sort of like an interpretation scale of this is the Office Vibe NPS rank score scale that the system we use provides themselves. And as you can see, 0 is okay, 10 is good, 30 is very good, and then the scale stops. So we concluded that we were good on that front as well. Often I'm asked, then what did your clients said? We are a private health company, right? And we have dealing with private companies as well as clients. We were a little bit cautious and nervous about it, but still we chose to be very proactive in our communication, not hiding it, but actually turning it around and say, yeah, it's so you might be a little bit curious what this means to you, but again, the choice is yours. You can choose one of our competitors. Have a plus 37-hour work week consultant. The hourly wage is the same, right? In Denmark, it would be approximately 180 euros per hour. Or you could choose one of ours, fully very engaged, well restituted, totally engaged. They're only working 30 hours per week, but the price is the same. What do you choose? And then after they say, oh yeah, of course, I get the point now. And when we measure it afterwards among our clients that has been a part of our shift, we could definitely see that we got a lot of support. Out of our 233 active clients, only 2 of them expressed skepticism. And this is 4 years ago that we did this measurement, and they are still clients with us. So I think we got them convinced in the end.
So just
and that was it for me. Thank you. And now I'll stop sharing my screen again.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bo. Right on time. Well, thank you both so much. We've got about 20 minutes left for Q&A. So if folks would like to raise their hand, use that function on Zoom, or type anything in the chat. I'm not seeing anything at the moment. You're welcome to do that. And if no one has any initial questions, I'm happy to get the conversation started. I would, something that we see a lot too is kind of the role in unions for either pushing for shorter working weeks, but also in the way that it's implemented. So I would just kind of love to hear, I know you mentioned that, Joe, too. It's like workers understand their job role and kind of the intricacies of their day-to-day best. And so maybe how either of you have seen that. And then also, Alex, I'll turn to you after this.
Yeah, I think unions have a critical role to play if we're going to move from this being a a novel niche thing that some employers do to be competitive to something that's much more embedded across the economy. I think it requires a kind of a pincer movement of, you know, employee grassroots demand, trade unions really prioritizing this in their collective bargaining strategies, and then also the kind of private market-led competition. I think that it probably depends on the country. I think here in North America, with the exception of obviously some of the great work that we've seen with the UAW in the Sanders legislation, I think unions have probably been less involved than maybe they have been in some European countries where there's, you know, higher level of collective bargaining coverage, higher levels of unionization. So I do think that combination is necessary, but I think we're already seeing, you know, when I started doing the first trial of this in Ireland in 2020, and then some of the early trials in the UK and North America in 2021, I would say the vast majority of companies that were doing this were ununionized. In the last year or two, that's started to change. About half of the clients that we currently work with have trade union representation. I think even in terms of the types of industries that you're seeing, you'll have seen Lamborghini in Italy, obviously moving in this direction through the collective bargaining process. And we're definitely seeing an increase in employers coming to us, either because unions have put pressure on them or because they are preempting future negotiations with unions and see, actually, if we can make this work, that will be, you know, an effective tool from an employer perspective in a collective bargaining conversation. So I feel like if we're going to expand this from very knowledge work, desk work oriented into some of the industries where it might be a little bit more tricky and more complex to implement, unions need to play a really, really big part in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Joe. Bo, if you wanted to add anything, but no worries if not.
I can just add that in Denmark, we see a huge interest and a lot of work from the union side pushing forward. And especially the union for representing members who study or work within the areas of law, economics, strategy management. They are spearheading it. Also, very interesting here is that they publish a lot of studies, all the unions currently, where they ask their members of the interest of reducing their time, but not only their interest, of course, but also how do they see themselves, their ability to do their work in less time, do the same amount of work in less time, and they do it. So there's a lot of, they publish these reports and get a lot of attention in the media. The union JUF I just mentioned before, they asked their members recently, and it was 4 out of 5 who specifically wanted a 4-day work week, and the same amount of people believed that they were able to do the same amount of work, putting a lot of pressures on both employers, of course, but also the government. Currently, the government in Denmark are not in favor of work time reduction, not at all. Actually, their rhetorics are quite harsh. Saying something like, in Russia, they do not leave work at 4 p.m. So we can't do that either, because, like, really painting an image of threat, right?
Well, yeah, it's not the direction we'd like government's going, for sure. Alex, did you want to share a question?
Yeah, thank you very much to both the speakers. It's very sort of interesting perspectives on work time. I have 2 questions first for Joe, and I have 1 question for Bo. I was sort of wondering, with Joe, the experience that you have with, as you said, firms coming to you because either they had some pressure, or, you know, they're sort of foreseeing that something's going to happen, or that they just really want to do better. Is there any arguments, any learning points you think from those that could be used towards the firms that are are almost not engaging with this question at all? Is there anything that you could see at the moment that, you know, because a lot of what I've seen in my research is that some firms see this as a movement for the employee rather than the employer, so they almost don't want to engage with the question at all. So I'm wondering if it was there was anything you could recommend there. And then a little bit, of course, I liked your vision, but just playing a little bit, I guess, devil's advocate. The idea that the vision is that leaders are going to want to share the benefits of AI and the sort of gain in capital improvements with the labor force. How likely is that? Because at least from very UK and European trend, that's not really what the data is showing. So just some your thoughts there. For Bo, my question was, but you've answered that already a little bit now in what you just said, but I was wondering how much you think the Danish culture and that sort of, because my experience is that at least Scandinavians have a fair bit of respect for time and working time versus sort of leisure time. And I'm wondering how much you think that the culture in Denmark is playing into the acceptance of work time reduction, but now with the government, you've already commented a little bit. Thank you.
So to your second question, Alex, in terms of how likely is the vision, it depends who we're talking about. So my currency is progressive, forward-thinking leaders. That's our target audience in terms of trying to find companies or work with companies or persuade companies to make this switch and to help them to do it. And I think that vision, you know, for a progressive, forward-thinking leader in an innovative organization that maybe wants to get ahead of the curve, you know, wants to keep their best people, attract talent, wants to be maybe a little bit ahead of the game in terms of AI and new tools. I think that is a compelling vision, but I think you're right. That only gets us to, like, let's say, I think probably the percentage of companies that are doing 4-day work weeks or some version of work time reduction now, most of the research I've seen, it's kind of inched up from 2 or 3% to 4 or 5%, but it's still very, very niche. I think that approach can probably get us to 10, 12, or 15%, but it's not going to get us to mass adoption. And that's where, you know, for example, on the question of AI, I do think that in certain sectors, it will require government and policy intervention to look at this and say, you know, in sectors where you're going to see this really very disruptive effect, where you're going to have, like, sure, we know that new jobs are going to be created, but there's going to be immediate disruption where we're going to lose jobs. We're going to, you know, see people be, you know, forced into more part-time fractional roles. And seeing work time reduction as a way to kind of smooth that curve as a policy intervention, I do think that's going to be necessary. And I think that's an important complement to maybe the stuff that Bo and I are doing around, you know, working with particular companies to whom that message appeals. On the other question, learnings and lessons, I mean, I think it's either meeting the employer where they're at in terms of, and this might be, you know, I do think that there has to be some recognition of the conditionality of this. I think that in order to actually actively persuade an employer to do this, because they think it's going to be good for the business, there needs to be an openness to looking at this through the productivity lens, it being conditional on kind of defined metrics, you know, employees being very active and saying, if we were to try this, here are some of the ways that I think we could do our work better. So, you know, really almost taking that proactive role from the workforce, I think is going to be important. And then the other one is we have, give you an example, big employer we have that's working with us to explore reduced work time. The reason they're interested in it is because they're a global organization. They have a huge amount of discrepancies in their terms and conditions across different countries, different locations, different sites. They've never been able to make any progress in terms of trying to kind of standardize those. They see the 4-day work week as basically a big tool that they could go to the unions with and say, if we do 4-day work week, we want to move on standardization. So thinking about from the employer's perspective, what are the things that might be the trade-offs that help them to move in the right direction, is the kind of practical negotiation that maybe some unions need to have.
I can speak a little bit more to your question to me. I think actually, like, yes, it is correct. In Denmark, we have a culture of being quite respectful for not letting, like, working too hard, for example. That's not a narrative that we will strive to fuel. But in Denmark, we have a lot of very progressive companies moving the movement, going in front of it, and their voices are loud, and they are at the same time able to showcase some pretty impressive results. For example, we have a large chain of restaurants, something similar to McDonald's, but Danish. They moved into 4-day work week for first the administration, then all the restaurants a couple of years ago, they were completed. And their revenue records and results, they are all over the newspapers all the time. So stories like this really helps proving that it's financial sustainable. That is probably the biggest question, because everybody buys that we need to think differently. Also, the employers, especially within the knowledge industry, yes, but and that, I think, that's tied to the issue we have here in Denmark. It's probably somewhat the same in your countries, respective countries, that we have a stress, cases of stress that are really exploding. The latest, we had a report, the big national health profile coming out just last month, concluding that now it's 3 out of 10 Danish people who scores high on the stress scale. Compared to in 1990, it was 1 out of 20. So it's really a problem, and it's often within the knowledge sector we see those problems. So that's also, we definitely see the movement being a little bit leaning towards that's the knowledge tree that will adapt this before all the other industries, but it's probably also where the problems are biggest.
Great. Thank you both so much. I'm just going to elevate 2 questions from the chat. They're both directed to you, Joe. So for the first one, from which year do data on senior management expectations stem from, and is there proportional progress since those measurements? Example, the data is 1 year old, did 14% of the companies try a 4-day work week? And then the second one is, I'm always surprised to hear about statements about today's jobs, given that there are hundreds of them and differences are huge. Could you name a few where Pareto's law and the productivity graph you showed are less relevant because the worker cannot independently change productivity too much? So do you expect working time reduction in such jobs? And if yes, maybe through what mechanisms?
Great questions. I might take the second one first.
Definitely.
When we moved to a 5-day work week and an 8-hour workday, across the economy, a lot of that started in manufacturing and industrial industries, because that's where the power base in the economy lay. I think that there's a reality that that's not where the power base in the economy lies today. About 2/3 of workers in the US are in white-collar jobs. Blue collar has obviously been declining over a period of time. So the old trade union adage of, you make incremental gains and progress in areas so that you can expand out from there, I think is true here. And I think there is a reality here that this is going to probably happen quicker in some parts of the economy than it is in others. And I think that's where, there's a recognition here that principle, it applies, I think, to a lot of today's jobs and a lot of today's industries, not necessarily to all. And I'll give one example of healthcare. So there was a pretty well publicized trial in care homes in Scandinavia, which Bo's probably familiar with, where they trial shorter work hours in the care home for the care home assistants. Very positive impacts on staff outcomes, very positive impacts on patient outcomes, but they abandoned the trial because the cost went up. Basically, they had to hire more people. So I think if you take healthcare, that's an area where the argument is not do more with less. I would not for a second argue that nurses, hospital consultants, people in those kind of frontline healthcare professional roles can do more with less. The argument is that we have a chronic crisis of burnout, of issues around quality of care linked to overwork within the healthcare profession, which is a huge cost to the economy globally. And therefore, the argument is, yes, we need to hire more people. Yes, we need to increase headcount because it's going to deliver better outcomes for the staff and for patients. It's not like a tech company where I would argue most tech firms, many nonprofits, many professional services firms can probably do this effectively without necessarily needing to create more jobs. So I think that's where I think unions and policymakers really do come in those industries where that doesn't apply. On the data, you're right. It was about a year ago. Has there been 14%? Absolutely not. I think that the point of that is less about, it's expectations and perceptions versus reality, and there's a gap in that. And therefore, what we're trying to articulate is there's an opportunity for employers who kind of see this coming down the road, and then obviously getting out in front of it and being a pioneer, there are benefits to doing that. But you're right that, I think that there's a significant gap between the number of employers that, like Bill Gates is talking about a 3-day work week, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase is talking about a 3.5-day work week as a result of AI. Are either of them doing anything about it? I'd say probably not. And that's where it's up to us. But I think that, there is a gap between what people expect to happen and how many organizations are actively doing something about it today.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Joe. We've got about 2 minutes left. Is there any quick question that we could potentially answer? And if not, we'll wrap up. Okay. I'm not seeing anyone jumping for another last question. Well, so thank you so much, Joe and Bo, for all of your insight and great responses to questions. We really appreciate you being here and kind of sharing practitioners' perspectives on this issue. And good to know that we're all kind of fighting towards a better future for us all. Indy just dropped in the link for signing up for the European Work Time Network's mailing list. That's important because we have a next webinar taking place on Wednesday, the 29th of May for gender just work time reductions. Gender just work, yeah, okay, I said it right. These words are hard. And we'll be with 2 researchers from the European Environmental Bureau. And so if you follow that link, you can sign up and get the registration info for that next webinar. So looking forward to hopefully seeing you there. And as always, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks all everyone for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.